The lobby of Ashford Global went completely silent. 1 second earlier, Claire Whitmore had her arm raised, the most feared executive in the building, a woman who had made grown men resign with a single email. Her target was Emily Parker, a young janitor who had done nothing wrong. And no one moved. No one ever moved when Claire raised her voice. But the new security guard did. He caught her wrist mid-air, with one hand, calm, as if he had done it 100 times before, and said 4 words. "You don't have that right." Nobody knew who he really was. They were about to find out. Logan Hayes had been working the morning shift at Ashford Global for 11 days when everything changed. He arrived each day at 6:45, signed in at the security desk, pulled on his uniform, and took his position near the main entrance. He checked badges. He held doors. He nodded at the cleaning crew when they wheeled their carts through the lobby. Nobody paid much attention to him, which was exactly what he wanted. He was new, he was quiet, and he wore the same dark uniform as the 3 other guards on his shift. There was nothing about him that invited a second look. That was the point. Ashford Global occupied 32 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. The company dealt in logistics and supply chain management, and it had grown over the past 14 years from a 2-person operation into one of the most recognized firms in the country. The man who built it had stepped back from daily operations 6 years ago, handing the reins to a board of directors and a layer of senior management he had personally selected. He had trusted them to protect what he built. He had been wrong to trust without verifying. Logan was the man who built it, and this was how he chose to find out what had gone wrong. He had not told his assistant. He had not told the board. He had constructed a clean employee identity under his own legal name, routed through a staffing vendor that Ashford Global used for contract security personnel. A layer of separation thin enough that no one in the building would think to question it, but solid enough that a routine background check would produce nothing unusual. He had shown up on a Monday morning with a laminated badge and a uniform that fit well enough. Nobody questioned him because nobody thought to. A security guard at a corporate lobby is furniture, useful and visible and easy to overlook. He had done this once before, years ago at a distribution center in Ohio. He had spent 3 days on a warehouse floor and come back with more information than 6 months of internal audits had produced. This time felt more urgent. Over the past year, employee turnover in the Chicago headquarters had climbed sharply. Exit interviews were vague and carefully worded, the kind of language people use when they want to say something but are afraid of what saying it might cost them. Productivity numbers were steady, which should have been reassuring, but Logan had learned to be suspicious of numbers that looked too clean, so he came to see for himself. The lobby of Ashford Global was large and well lit with polished floors and a reception desk, positioned so that visitors were visible the moment they stepped through the glass doors. In the mornings, it filled quickly executives in sharp suits, analysts with coffee cups, administrative staff moving in clusters toward the elevators. Logan watched all of it from his post near the east entrance. He watched who walked fast and who walked careful. He watched who made eye contact and who looked at the floor. After 11 days, he had a clear enough picture of the social geography of the building. He knew which floors had the most tension. He knew which managers made the room shift when they walked in. Claire Whitmore made the entire lobby shift. She was the head of operations, and she arrived every morning between 8 and 8:15, always dressed in something dark and precisely fitted, always moving with the kind of deliberate pace that made people step aside without being asked. Logan had watched her for 11 days. He had seen her speak to a department head in the elevator lobby in a tone so flat and cutting that the man had not said a single word in response. He had seen her send back a catered lunch order because one item was wrong and stand over the catering manager while he made calls to fix it. He had seen people reroute their morning path through the lobby just to avoid crossing her line of sight. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was precise about it. She chose her moments carefully, and she always had a justification ready. Something that sounded like standards or accountability, but functioned more like control. The people around her had learned to be small and fast and apologetic. That was the environment she had built, and everyone inside it had adapted to survive. Logan watched all of this and said nothing. He was still gathering information. He was still trying to understand the full scope of what he was looking at. He told himself that one person, however difficult, was not the whole picture. He told himself he needed more time. Then came the morning of the 12th day. It was a Tuesday. The lobby was at its busiest somewhere around 8:20, with people moving in every direction. Emily Parker was working near the center of the space, mopping a section of the floor that had been marked off with a small yellow sign. She was 24 years old and had been with the cleaning staff for about 8 months. Logan had noticed her before she was efficient and unobtrusive, the kind of worker who finished a task and moved to the next one without needing to be told. She kept her head down and her work visible, and she never lingered in spaces where she might be in the way. Claire came through the main entrance at 8:17, holding a large coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, moving at her usual speed. The lobby was crowded, and someone shifted slightly in the flow of foot traffic, bumping into Claire from the side. The coffee tilted. The lid held for half a second, then gave, and a wide arc of dark liquid splashed across the polished floor and across the edge of Emily's cart. Claire looked at the spill. She looked at Emily. And then, with the kind of calm that is colder than shouting, she said that this was exactly what happened when the cleaning staff did not pay attention to where they positioned their equipment. Emily opened her mouth to explain that she had marked the area, that the sign was right there, that she had been well within the designated section. Claire did not let her finish. Her voice did not rise, but it carried the kind of voice trained to be heard across a room without effort, and she said that she did not want an explanation. She wanted the floor cleaned, and she wanted it done by someone who understood that their job was to prevent problems, not to create them and then argue about it. People nearby had stopped moving. Not all of them, but enough. Eyes moved toward the center of the lobby, and then quickly away, the practiced reflex of people who had learned that looking too long was a form of involvement. Emily's face had gone still and careful, the expression of someone holding something tightly so it would not show. She bent down and began cleaning the spill without another word. That should have been the end of it. In this building, that was usually the end of it. But Claire was still standing there. She said in the same carrying voice that this was the 3rd time in 2 weeks that something in this building had reflected poorly on the facilities team, and that if the staff could not be trusted to do their jobs without supervision, then perhaps supervision was exactly what they needed, full-time and unpleasant. Emily's hand slowed. She looked up, not quite meeting Claire's eyes, and said quietly that she was sorry, but she had followed every protocol this morning, and she did not think it was fair till Claire's arm came up. It was fast, the kind of motion that happens before the brain has finished deciding. The hand was open. It was aimed at Emily's face. And every person in that lobby who was watching, and by then most of them were watching, understood exactly what was about to happen, and did not move a single inch to stop it. Logan moved. He crossed the distance in 4 steps, and he caught Claire's wrist with one hand, holding it still, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough that it was not going anywhere. The motion was clean and without anger. He looked at Claire the way a person looks at something they are trying to assess accurately, and he said, "You don't have that right." The lobby went completely quiet. Claire's expression did not collapse immediately. She was too experienced for that, too accustomed to being the person in the room with the most authority. But something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of something she had not expected to feel in this building, in this lobby, in front of these people. She looked at Logan's hand on her wrist, and then she looked at his face, and what she saw, there was not aggression, and it was not fear. It was simply a man who had decided that this was not going to happen. She pulled her wrist back. He let go. She straightened her jacket with 2 precise movements and looked at him in the way she looked at things she intended to deal with later. Then she looked out at the lobby, at the faces, watching from a careful distance, and her expression became the kind of neutral that is itself a message, a reminder that she saw who was watching, and she would remember. She picked up what remained of her coffee, turned, and walked toward the elevators. The lobby exhaled. Emily was still crouched near her cart, the wet cloth in her hands not moving. She looked up at Logan with an expression he could not fully read, relief maybe, and something underneath it that looked like fear of what came next. He looked back at her and said simply that she should finish up and not worry about it. She nodded once and looked back down at the floor. Logan returned to his post near the east entrance. Around him, the lobby slowly resumed its normal rhythm, feet-moving conversations, restarting the ordinary sounds of a morning in a large building. But something had changed in the texture of it. People moved a little differently than they had 10 minutes ago. Some of them glanced at him as they passed. A few looked away quickly. One young analyst passing close by gave him a look that was hard to interpret, somewhere between gratitude and the specific kind of pity people reserve for someone who has just done something they genuinely admire and genuinely believe will end badly. Logan stood at his post and kept his face neutral. Inside, he was doing what he had been doing for 11 days, watching, measuring, cataloging. But something had shifted in his own assessment, and he knew it. He had not planned to intervene. He had planned to observe, to keep his identity protected for as long as possible, to gather enough information to make decisions from a position of full knowledge. Intervention was not part of the plan, and yet he had not been able to stand there and watch. That told him something. Not about Claire Whitmore. Specifically, he had already seen enough of her to form a working understanding of who she was and how she operated. What it told him was something about the environment itself, about what this place had become in the years since he had stepped away. A lobby full of people, none of them willing to move. A woman with her arm raised, and everyone looking at the floor. That did not happen overnight. That was the result of a culture built over time in which the cost of doing the right thing had been made to feel higher than the cost of looking away. He had built this company. He had walked away and trusted it to people he believed were capable of protecting it. And while he was gone, something had rotted quietly at the center of it, and the people who worked here every day had learned to live around the rot, because no one had given them any reason to believe that speaking up would lead anywhere except down. Logan understood now that his timeline had changed. He had come here to observe. He had stayed 11 days without revealing himself, without intervening, without doing anything that might draw attention before he had a complete picture. But today, he had drawn attention in the most visible way possible in the middle of the lobby at peak morning traffic in front of half the building. He had no illusions about what that meant. Claire Whitmore was not a woman who forgot, and she was not a woman who left things unresolved. She would begin moving against him almost immediately. And Emily Parker, who had done nothing except show up for work and do her job, would be in the crosshairs alongside him. He thought about what he had seen in Emily's face when she looked up at him, that specific combination of relief and dread, the face of someone who had already calculated the cost and knew it would come. She had been in this building for 8 months. She had learned the way everyone in this building had learned that the rules here were not the rules printed in the employee handbook. The real rules were different, and they were enforced by people like Claire Whitmore, and the enforcement was consistent and without mercy. Logan had spent 11 days watching. He had what he needed to understand the problem. What he had not worked out yet was the full scope of the solution, not the surface correction, not simply removing Claire or restructuring a department, but the deeper work of changing what this place was and replacing it with what it was supposed to be. That would take more time, more information, and more visibility into how far the damage actually ran. But first, he was going to have to survive what was coming next. And so was Emily Parker. He stood at his post and watched the lobby, and when the shift changed at noon and the next guard came to relieve him, he signed out and walked to his car and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. He had made a choice today. He had chosen to be visible. Now he had to decide what to do with that. The retaliation started the next morning. Emily was reassigned before she even clocked in. Her regular section, the main lobby and the east corridor on the ground floor, was given to another member of the cleaning crew. She was told by a facilities supervisor, who would not meet her eyes, that she had been moved to the loading dock and the basement storage areas. The explanation given was rotation. Everyone on the team knew it was not rotation. Emily took the new assignment without argument and went to work in a space where there were no windows and no one to see her, which was exactly the point. Logan's shift changes came through the same day. He was moved off the main entrance and reassigned to the parking structure, 3 levels of concrete and fluorescent lighting, a post that saw almost no foot traffic and required almost no interaction with anyone inside the building. His hours were adjusted to include the late evening shift, starting at 4 in the afternoon and running until midnight. The official reason was staffing needs. The security team supervisor delivered the news with the carefully blank expression of a man who understood that he was carrying a message and wanted no part of what it meant. Logan accepted the reassignment without complaint. He said thank you and asked where he should report. The supervisor looked mildly unsettled by the response, as if he had expected something else, and told him level 2 of the parking structure east stairwell. It was, Logan noted, as far from the center of the building as it was possible to be, while still technically being on the property. He worked the parking structure for 4 days. He checked access cards at the gate, made rounds on each level at the intervals specified in the post manual, and used the quiet to think. The reassignment had achieved what it was designed to achieve in terms of logistics. He was no longer visible in the lobby, no longer positioned where he could observe the daily movement of the building. But it had not achieved what Claire likely intended it to achieve, which was to make him feel isolated and remind him of how small his position was. Logan had spent 14 years building something from nothing. He had a reasonably high tolerance for uncomfortable circumstances. What he did not have tolerance for was what he was learning through other channels. He had 2 people inside the company he trusted, not as allies, because they did not know who he was, but as sources. One was a mid-level analyst named Derek Walsh, who had been with Ashford Global for 6 years and had the particular quality of someone who noticed things and preferred not to pretend otherwise. The other was a woman named Sandra Ortiz, who worked in human resources and had filed 3 internal memos in the past year about turnover patterns in departments that reported to operations. Neither of them knew Logan was anything other than a security guard. But Derek Walsh had a habit of smoking in the parking structure on his afternoon break, and during those breaks he talked, because Logan was there, and Logan listened, and Logan had learned early in his career that people tell you almost everything if you simply give them space to do it. Derek told him about Marcus Reed. Marcus had been a senior logistics coordinator, one of the best in the building. By most accounts, someone who had built strong relationships with key vendors and had a reputation for solving problems that other departments brought to him. He had resigned 4 months ago. His exit interview was on file in HR and said nothing useful, the standard language about pursuing other opportunities, about gratitude for his time at the company. What Derek told Logan, in the parking structure on a Thursday afternoon, with a cigarette burning down between his fingers, was that Marcus had left because Claire Whitmore had taken credit for a supply chain solution he had developed over the course of nearly a year, presented it to the board as her own initiative, and then, when Marcus raised the issue quietly through an internal channel, had made his work life so systematically unpleasant that staying became genuinely untenable. Logan listened to all of it without showing what he was thinking. Derek finished his cigarette and said more quietly that Marcus was not the only one, that there had been others. that people in the operations division had learned to keep their ideas to themselves or share them only with people they absolutely trusted, because anything that made it to Claire's desk had a way of becoming Claire's idea. Derek said he had no proof of any of it, just the accumulated knowledge of someone who had watched the same pattern repeat enough times to stop believing in coincidence. Logan went home that night and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He had come to this building expecting to find management problems. He had found something that operated more like a system, not one person behaving badly in isolated moments, but a set of practices and pressures that had been running long enough to reshape how people inside the company understood their own value and their own safety. The talented ones left. The ones who stayed learned to be careful to be small, to give credit upward and take blame downward, and never under any circumstances attract the wrong kind of attention. It was efficient in a terrible way. It kept things quiet. It kept the surface numbers clean, while everything underneath continued to hollow out. He thought about the lobby on that Tuesday morning. He thought about the faces he had seen, all of them turned away, all of them choosing not to see. He had been angry when he saw it, a clean and specific anger, but sitting at his kitchen table he understood it differently. Those people were not indifferent. They were not cowards in the simple sense. They were people who had been taught repeatedly and at real personal cost that looking away was the rational choice. That was not their failure. That was his. He was the one who had built this place. He was the one who had walked away and told himself that structures and policies and the right people in the right positions would be enough. He had not stayed close enough to see what was actually happening on the floors he built. The responsibility for that belonged to him, and he did not intend to spend time arguing otherwise. The following week, Claire moved into a second phase. Emily's supervisor began documenting her performance in a way that hadn't happened before: small notes, minor complaints, nothing that would be obviously retaliatory, but enough to build a paper trail. Emily was given tasks that were technically within her job description, but were structured to be difficult to complete correctly within the allotted time. And when she fell short, the shortfall was logged. Logan heard about this from Sandra Ortiz, who had noticed the sudden volume of performance documentation on a single junior employee and flagged it internally to no one in particular, because she had learned that flagging things internally mostly produced silence. At the same time, Logan began receiving formal written complaints about his conduct. They arrived through the security team's internal reporting system and cited things like failure to greet visitors with adequate professionalism, failure to maintain proper post discipline, and one complaint that described him as creating a hostile environment for management-level staff. The complaints were unsigned, which was permitted under the company's reporting policy. They were vague enough to be difficult to dispute and specific enough to accumulate. He read each one carefully and kept copies. Claire also began asking questions about him, not directly, not in any way that left a clear trail, but Logan could see the shape of it. His personnel file was accessed twice in 1 week by an account that traced to the operations division. A background check was run through the company's security vendor using a request that had been routed through a third-party administrator. Whatever she found came back clean because the identity he had constructed was clean. But the fact that she was looking told him she had already decided he was something other than what he appeared to be. She was right. She just did not know yet what that something was. 3 weeks after the lobby incident, Claire called a departmental meeting that included the facilities team and the security division, an unusual pairing that raised eyebrows among the supervisors involved. The meeting was framed as a performance review and operational alignment session. What it actually was, as became clear within the first 15 minutes, was a public accounting of failures. She moved through a list of incidents, all of them attributed to individual members of the facilities and security teams, delivered in the same flat, precise tone Logan had heard in the lobby. The point was not information. The point was demonstration. A reminder directed at every person in that room of who held authority over their continued employment. Logan sat in the back row and watched the faces around him. He saw the same thing he had seen in the lobby on that Tuesday morning, people making themselves small. People agreeing with things they did not agree with because the alternative was worse. A facilities supervisor named Glenn Archer, who Logan knew from Derek Walsh as someone who had been with the company for 9 years and had a genuinely good reputation among his staff, sat 2 rows ahead and said nothing when Claire attributed a maintenance error to his team that Logan was nearly certain had originated in a vendor communication failure that Claire's own department had mishandled. Glenn Archer said nothing. He wrote something in his notebook and did not look up. After the meeting, Claire announced that 2 positions were under review for immediate disciplinary action, pending formal HR process. She did not name the positions in the meeting. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood who she meant. Emily heard about it before the end of the day. Logan heard about it an hour after Emily from Derek Walsh, who looked genuinely troubled and said he thought Logan should know what was coming. Logan thanked him and said he appreciated it, and Derek looked at him for a moment with an expression that had a question in it, a question about who Logan actually was, because by then, some of the people in the building had started to look at him differently, in the way people look at someone who does not behave the way their position suggests they should behave. And then Derek left without asking the question out loud. That evening, Logan made 2 calls from a phone that was not the one registered to his employee file. The first call was to his personal attorney. The second was to a man named Robert Hale, who was the chairman of the Ashford Global Board of Directors and the only board member Logan had remained in close contact with since stepping back from active leadership. Logan told Robert that he needed 48 hours before any formal board action was taken on anything originating from the operations division. Robert asked no questions, which was one of the reasons Logan had always trusted him and said he understood. By the following week, Claire had constructed what she needed. She brought a formal complaint to HR citing Logan for conduct, unbecoming a security professional, with particular reference to the lobby incident, which she characterized in the documentation as an unauthorized physical altercation with a management-level employee. Attached to the complaint were the written reports that had been filed over the preceding weeks, the accessed personnel notes, and a statement from a witness whose name Logan did not recognize, and whom he was fairly certain did not exist in the form presented. Emily's case was filed simultaneously, alleged theft of company supplies, based on an inventory discrepancy in the basement storage area where Emily had been reassigned. The discrepancy was real. Logan had looked into it. It had originated before Emily was ever assigned to that section. The HR director, a careful man named Arthur Cole, who had been in the role for 4 years and had the look of someone who had seen things he wished he had not processed, both complaints, and issued suspension notices the same afternoon. Logan received his at the security desk at the end of his shift. He read it standing in the parking structure under the fluorescent lights on level 2, and then folded it in half and put it in his jacket pocket. The next morning, a company-wide email went out under Claire Whitmore's name. It referenced ongoing personnel matters, cited the company's commitment to maintaining a professional and accountable work environment, and noted that 2 employees were currently under suspension, pending investigation with termination proceedings to follow. It did not name Logan or Emily. It did not need to. By noon, everyone in the building knew exactly who it meant. Claire had done what she set out to do. She had moved fast. She had used the available systems precisely, and she had positioned herself between the problem and the outcome in a way that looked procedurally correct from every angle that mattered. She had been thorough. She had been efficient. What she had not done was check whether any of the systems she was using had anyone else watching them. The emergency board meeting was called for a Thursday morning, 9 o'clock, 32nd floor. The notice went out through official channels the evening before, routed through Arthur Cole in HR, and countersigned by Robert Hale as board chairman. The stated purpose was a personnel and governance review which was corporate language for something serious enough to require the full board in the same room. 12 directors were notified. All 12 confirmed attendance. That alone was unusual. Full attendance at an emergency session was rare, and the people who worked on the 32nd floor noticed it and said very little to each other about what it might mean. Claire received her notification the same way everyone else did. She read it at her desk, and if she felt anything other than confidence, it did not show in how she spent the rest of that evening. She had done everything correctly, or as correctly as she understood correctly to mean. The complaints were filed. The suspensions were issued. The HR process was moving on the timeline she had set in motion. She had managed more complicated situations than this one, and had come out of all of them with her position intact and stronger. She had no reason to believe this would be different. She arrived at the 32nd floor at 8:50 the following morning, sharp and composed, and took a seat at the conference table with the particular ease of someone who expects to be the most prepared person in the room. The board members filtered in over the next several minutes. Robert Hale arrived at 8:58 and took his seat at the head of the table without making eye contact with Claire, which she noted but did not interpret as significant. Board chairs did not make small talk before formal sessions. That was normal. That meant nothing. At 9 o'clock, exactly, the door at the far end of the room opened. Logan Hayes walked in. He was not wearing the dark uniform of the Ashford Global Security staff. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, a white shirt with the collar open at the top. He carried nothing in his hands. He walked to the empty seat at the table, not one of the side chairs reserved for presenters or HR personnel, but a seat at the table itself positioned directly across from Robert Hale, and he sat down. Every board member in the room rose. Not as a choreographed gesture, not at anyone's signal, but in the way people rise when someone they recognize and defer to enters a space. It was automatic, the kind of response that had been built through years of knowing exactly who this man was and what his presence in a room meant. Claire did not rise. She did not know what was happening, but she understood in the first 2 seconds that the shape of the room had changed in a way she had not prepared for. She looked at Logan, at the man she had seen in the lobby, the man she had reassigned and reported and suspended and intended to terminate, and she waited for someone to explain. No one explained anything. Robert Hale simply said that the meeting was now in session and that Logan Hayes, founder and sole owner of Ashford Global, would be presenting the first item on the agenda. The words reached Claire in pieces. Founder, sole owner, Logan Hayes, the security guard, the man whose wrist she had pulled back from, the man she had sent written complaints about had suspended, had publicly flagged in a company-wide email as a personnel problem under investigation. She looked at him across the table, and Logan looked back at her with the same expression he had worn in the lobby on that Tuesday morning. Not triumphant, not angry, simply the expression of someone who had decided what he was going to do and was now doing it. Logan opened the meeting by telling the board that he had spent the past 5 weeks working inside Ashford Global as a member of the security staff. He said this without preface or dramatic framing. He stated it as a fact, the way a person states the starting conditions of a problem before moving to the substance of it. He said he had come because the company's turnover data had indicated something was wrong at the structural level, and he had wanted to see it directly rather than through a filtered report. He said that what he had found was worse than what the data had suggested. Then he presented the evidence. It had been compiled over 5 weeks of observation, supplemented by documentation he had obtained through the company's own internal systems, once he had disclosed his identity to the board chairman and requested formal access. There were modified performance reports, original versions, and revised versions, showing where numbers had been adjusted after the fact to redistribute credit and accountability in ways that did not reflect actual outcomes. There were internal emails pulled from the company's archived communications with the board's authorization, in which instructions were given to mid-level managers about how to document certain incidents and how to characterize certain employees in ways that would hold up to HR scrutiny. There were records showing the inventory discrepancy that had been used to file a theft complaint against Emily Parker records that included timestamps demonstrating the discrepancy had existed for 6 weeks before Emily was ever assigned to that section of the building. There was also a folder containing the names of 14 employees who had left Ashford Global in the past 2 years from departments under the operations division. Logan did not read the names aloud. He placed the folder on the table and said that each of those departures had occurred within 3 months of the employee raising a concern, filing a report, or producing work that had subsequently appeared in a presentation or proposal under a different name. He said that he had spoken with 7 of those former employees in the past week, and that all 7 had given consistent accounts of the same patterns. Sandra Ortiz from Human Resources had been asked to attend as a factual witness. She sat along the wall to the left of the board table, a folder of her own in her lap, the 3 internal memos she had filed over the past year, the ones that had been received and filed away and acted upon by no one. Logan referenced those memos directly during his presentation, noting that the warning signs had been documented internally and had not reached the board through normal channels. Sandra did not speak during the presentation, but the memos were entered into the formal record, which was the thing that mattered. Claire's attorney, who she had called the previous evening as a precaution, and who was seated behind her along the wall, leaned forward once during this portion of the presentation and said something quietly near her ear. Claire did not respond. She was watching Logan work through the materials on the table, watching the board members follow along on the documents that had been distributed before the session. And she was doing the calculation that a person does when they realize that the position they believed was strong was built on a foundation that someone else had been quietly mapping for weeks. Robert Hale asked Claire if she wished to respond to any specific items before the board moved to deliberation. He asked it in the measured tone of a man who had conducted difficult meetings before and understood that the form of the process mattered even when the outcome was not in question. Claire looked at the documents in front of the board members. She looked at the folder with the 14 names. She said that she would be consulting with her attorney before making any formal response, which was the correct legal answer and the only one available to her at that moment. Robert Hale nodded and said that was her right, and that the board would proceed accordingly. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Logan was not in the room for it. He stepped out at Robert Hale's request standard procedure for matters involving personnel decisions, where the owner also had direct involvement in the events under review. He waited in a smaller room down the hall, a glass-walled space with a view of the Chicago skyline, and he stood at the window and looked out at the city while the board worked through what it needed to work through. He was not anxious about the outcome. He was thinking about what came after it, the actual work of changing something that had been running in the wrong direction for years, the difference between removing a problem and building something better in its place. The board's decision was delivered in writing, as required by the company's governance procedures. Claire Whitmore was removed from her position as head of operations, effective immediately pending a full compliance review that would determine the extent of any additional accountability measures. The complaints filed against Logan were formally withdrawn and removed from record. The complaint filed against Emily Parker was dismissed in full, with a notation that the supporting documentation had been found to be factually inaccurate. Arthur Cole from HR delivered Emily's notification personally. He found her in the basement level where she had been assigned, working alone in the storage area, and he told her that the case against her had been closed, that the findings had been reviewed at the board level, and that she was to be reinstated to her regular assignment, effective the following Monday. Emily listened to all of it without interrupting. When Arthur finished, she asked in a voice that was steady but careful whether she still had a job. Arthur told her yes without qualification. Emily looked at the floor for a moment, then looked back up and said, "Thank you," and went back to work. Logan heard about that exchange from Arthur Cole later the same afternoon. He did not comment on it, but he thought about it, about the specific quality of that question, whether she still had a job, The fact that her first response to being cleared of a false accusation was not relief or vindication, but a practical question about her immediate security. That was what a person sounded like after 8 months of learning that the ground they stood on could shift at any time. It was a data point, and it told him that fixing the formal processes was necessary, but not sufficient. The people who worked in this building had been shaped by the environment they had been living in. That did not reverse itself because a decision was handed down. The real work, as he had been telling himself since the night in the parking structure, was not the removal. It was the reconstruction. Over the following weeks, Logan moved through the building differently than he had before. He was known now there was no version of things in which he could return to invisibility, but he used the visibility deliberately rather than performing from behind a desk on the 32nd floor. He walked the floors. He sat in department meetings. He had conversations with the facilities staff and the analyst team and the logistics coordinators, not as an executive conducting a review, but as someone who was trying to understand what this place actually was day to day at the level where the work happened. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers, without redirecting them toward the conclusions he had already drawn. Derek Walsh was one of the first people he sat down with formally. Derek came into the meeting clearly uncertain about what it meant, and Logan told him directly that the conversation he had in the parking structure, the things Derek had told him about Marcus Reed, and the patterns in the operations division had been important, that it had mattered. Derek was quiet for a moment, and then said that he had not been sure when he was saying those things, whether they would go anywhere or whether he would end up regretting having said them. Logan told him that he understood that, and that he intended to build a company where that calculation did not feel necessary. Derek looked at him with an expression that was not quite belief yet, but was moving in that direction, and said he hoped that was true. The restructuring of the operations division took 3 months. A new head of operations was brought in from outside, a woman named Patricia Graves, who had a reputation for building functional teams in environments that had been through significant disruption. Logan spent 2 weeks with Patricia before her first official day, going through everything he had documented during his 5 weeks on the security staff. Not as a briefing, but as a shared review of problems that needed solutions neither of them had fully worked out yet. Patricia was direct and occasionally blunt in ways that Logan respected, and she asked hard questions about the board's appetite for the kind of changes she believed were necessary. Logan told her that the board would follow his lead on this, and that his lead was to do it right, which she said was the answer she had needed to hear before accepting the position. Sandra Ortiz remained in her role in human resources. In the months following the board meeting, the internal reporting channels that had previously produced silence began to produce responses. Memos were acknowledged. Concerns were followed up on. Sandra noticed the change in the way a person notices something they had stopped expecting carefully, and without quite trusting it at first. By the end of the restructuring period, she had been part of 3 separate process reviews that had resulted in actual policy changes. She did not send Logan a note about it. She did not need to. The work spoke for itself, which was how it was supposed to be. Emily Parker was promoted 4 months after the board meeting. The promotion came through Patricia Graves based on a performance review that Patricia had conducted herself, and it moved Emily from the facilities cleaning staff to a junior coordinator role in building services management, a position that came with a different title, a significant pay increase, and work that used the organizational abilities Emily had been applying in a basement storage room to no visible effect for the better part of a year. Emily was given the news on a Friday afternoon and asked for the weekend to think about it, which Patricia granted without comment. Emily called back on the Monday morning and said yes. Logan was in a meeting when he heard. Someone mentioned it in passing, a detail at the end of a longer update, and he nodded and moved on to the next item. But after the meeting ended and the room cleared, he stayed in his chair for a few minutes and thought about a Tuesday morning in a lobby, and a young woman crouched near a cart with a wet cloth in her hands, and the specific look on her face when she realized that someone had moved when everyone else had chosen not to. He thought about how the lobby looked in the mornings, now different in small ways, not dramatically transformed. Not the subject of some internal campaign about company values, just different in the ordinary texture of how people moved and spoke and occupied the same space. People made eye contact in the elevators. The cleaning crew worked during peak hours without moving, as if they were trying not to be seen. Glenn Archer, the facilities supervisor who had sat in that meeting and written in his notebook without looking up, had sent Logan a short email 3 weeks after the board meeting that said only that he wanted Logan to know he thought things were headed in the right direction. Logan had replied with 2 sentences and kept the email. He was back in the lobby on a Wednesday morning, 6 months after the day he had first walked in with a laminated badge and a uniform. He was not there for any particular reason, no scheduled meeting, no planned walkthrough. He had come in early and taken a different route through the building than usual, and it had brought him through the main entrance at the start of the morning rush. He stood near the east wall for a few minutes and watched the lobby fill. People moved the way people move when they are not afraid of the space they are moving through. Someone laughed near the reception desk, a real laugh, short and unself-conscious. 2 members of the facilities crew were talking near the elevator bank about something that had nothing to do with work, the easy conversation of people who are comfortable where they are. A group of analysts came through the main doors together, and one of them held the door for the person behind her without thinking about it, the automatic courtesy of someone whose first instinct in this building was not self-protection. Logan watched all of it and said nothing. After a few minutes, he straightened his jacket and walked toward the elevators. The morning was beginning. There was work to do, the ordinary work of running a company and getting things right, the kind of work that did not have a single day where it was finished. He understood that clearly and had no objection to it. He pressed the button for the 32nd floor and waited, and when the doors opened, he stepped inside, and the lobby continued behind him, the way a lobby does, full of ordinary people, moving without fear, doing their work.